All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in this anti-colonial world building panel. We have six amazing panelists that we're going to learn from today. If we could just go around and have some introductions.
Hey everybody, I'm Anya. I am a writer of various things, a theater artist, and a social worker. I live in New York City with my cat Sycorax, and a whole lot of books. I'm a theater director and I write for the stage. I'm also a speculative fiction author. You can find some of my short stories in venues like Fantasy Magazine, Myth Access, and Drama Spaceways Magazine. And my debut novel, Queen of All, which is the first in a planned trilogy, is coming out in an alarmingly short amount of time. It'll be coming June 8th from Zenith Press, and it is sort of a classic coming of age, coming into your own power, discovering magic, YA fantasy novel with hopefully some exciting queer twists and turns along the way.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cindy Hahn. I am a science fiction fantasy author, primarily of short fiction right now. I've got a story coming out in Analog, hopefully sometime later this year. Also a story in Dreamforge magazine and a nonfiction essay in Choreo magazine. And I've also had stories published in anthologies edited by Kevin J. Anderson and Christine Catherine Rush, among others. Writing is my primary focus, although I have had more careers than I care to count, as I think a lot of us have as we're trying to make the writing the full-time job. Based out of Salt Lake City right now. I grew up in California, born in Taiwan.
Bulavinaka, everyone. My name is Isabella Nanduki. I am an Indigenous Fijian writer. I'm also a researcher and scholar, and my interests lie in the contemporary spaces and the Indigenous perspective in creative fiction and creative nonfiction writing. The reason I kind of gravitate towards this specific genre is because of the way that we tell our stories as an Indigenous peoples. It's very much heavily focused on oral testimony, and I think there's so much space and so much interest out there for not only the writers and the creators, but also the readers outside of the Indigenous communities. Finaka.
Thank you. My name is Manuel Godoy, the CEO of Black Sands Entertainment. I am a publisher that focuses on African American history before slavery. And with that premise alone, I am probably 100% anti-colonial in the stuff that I write. As far as the titles we have about 40 different titles coming to our app right now, which focuses a lot on history of not just African countries, but also anybody who has felt the colonial reach, hit their country, and very historically dynamic, right? That's things that we care about the most. And, we're just happy to be here today with you guys. And let's get this started.
Hi, I'm Mina. So I'm from Ann Arbor. I am a staff attorney in my day job, and right now I'm also just primarily writing short fiction. I'm just trying to get whatever novel ideas I've got off the ground. Primarily they're featuring Asian or Asian American protagonists because, as a kid growing up, I really didn't see a lot of that when I was reading, and I feel like it's my duty to try and make sure that other kids don't ever have to feel that isolated. So because there weren't a lot of stories about kids coming from Taiwan or kids with Taiwanese parents. So I'm just here to kind of fill the void a bit. So some of my stories can be seen in Kaleidotrope, Translunar Traveler's Lounge. I've also been in 2 anthologies. One is Robot Dinosaurs, edited by Merck Finn Wolfmore, and the other is An Alphabet of Embers, edited by R.B. Lemberg. And there was an anthology of retold fairy tales by people of color that Alternating Current Press released in January, and I'm also in that too. So actually 3.
Great, well, I'm so excited to have everyone here today and to dive into this topic. So anti-colonial world building might be new to a lot of people. So let's start with the basics. What is anti-colonial world building? What does it mean?
Well, I'll shoot a shot at this. I believe really it's focusing more on the culture outside of a colonial power, right, from their perspective. So making sure that most of the elements are understood from the native culture as opposed to from a Western viewpoint is probably the basis for like developing a world uh, um, that's anti-colonial or something like that. I think that's the best way to sum that up.
I think it's also portraying culture side by side where one culture isn't subjugated to another. There isn't a power disparity between the cultures, and each culture brings something equitable to the table. And so, yeah, I think that's also part of it, is just making sure you don't have an oppressor and an oppressed in your world building.
I think there's a lot of different ways that anti-colonial world building can be done practically, in terms of what the world building ends up looking like and how that relates to the colonial forces in real world history. The way I think of anti-colonial work in my own world building is just in terms of doing my world building with the politics of anti-colonialism in mind. So that means things like, to me, it's very important to be aware that a lot of the structures of colonialism that we see in our current day-to-day life are not natural structures. They don't need to be there. That oppression, and specifically colonial oppression, is not, a natural fundamental part of the human condition. So if I'm going to incorporate features of that, if there's going to be a history of colonialism, a history of violence by one people against another people in my world, being conscientious that of the real world power structures that kind of replicates, and of the effect that is going to have on readers. And so I think of it, I guess, more as world building. The world building itself doesn't need to undo or not contain elements of colonialism. It's world building that's done with the ultimate intention, the ultimate goal in mind of undoing colonialism in reality, in the real world. And that is, in my experience, done by being really intentional about how colonialism and political power show up in the world building, and really thoughtful about the way that intersects with the world I'm trying to create.
For me, in order to answer the question, it's just about acknowledging that there's different contextual definitions of world building understood by the writers and creators in whichever genre you're creating content for. For example, as an Indigenous Fijian writing, world building for me is the process of creating entire fantasy worlds from scratch based on my lived experience as an Indigenous person, all while considering the logistics of what are these worlds made up of, or making them as believable as possible for the consumers of my content. It asks the questions about the setting of a world, and often the way that the world building process, the anti-colonial world building process that I go through as a writer, answers them, and often in very great detail, but centers me as an Indigenous writer and the Indigenous perspective always. Naka.
I've always thought about decolonizing in a rather small scale way. So I've always, in my writing, because I've been raised in the United States, I have to consciously undo biases. Like how would a certain person look if they were white or a person of color? And I have to confront biases like, do I think this feature, how do I think this feature looks? And am I looking at that from how I've been raised in the United States, or am I looking at that from the point of view of someone who's been raised somewhere else? Things like that. So there's descriptions, there's food, there's just ways of living that would not seem I guess, normal to me, but were probably quite commonplace for everybody else. And that's something to consciously think of when you're writing and trying to just kind of undo those, just to undo those biases that you have within yourself. It's probably not as large scale as everyone else. They've had really great answers, but that's how I come to it. There was also a class I took from Clarion West last year about decolonizing fiction, and they had some really great ideas, like talking about some systems that I didn't really consider colonial in the first place, like such as monarchies, and how we would maybe dismantle them or show alternate versions of leadership. But I also want to say that just like what Anya said, just showing in your fiction maybe some elements of colonialism, but also working to dismantle them is also a really good way to decolonize, because I've seen some books where they will address the fact that this is actually not, like, where there is a colonizer, and they will address that this is really actually not a great thing, or there will be a system at the end to try and work toward dismantling that.
I find this is very fascinating. I don't know a lot about this subject, so I find it super interesting. And it sounds like the intention, like you have to be super intentional in trying to look at what are your biases from where you've grown up, and then trying to dismantle them, which sounds very challenging. Because I think a lot of the things that you don't know make up you as a person are so much of where you grew up. Do you find it sounds like it's very challenging for the writer. Do you also think it's challenging for the reader, or are they able just to get lost in it? Or is it more like, this is super different?
Well, I've seen some people who will review books who are not part of the, like, not in the same in group as the author writing them, like not the same ethnicity, and they'll be like, oh, I can't relate. And I'm just like, okay, well, are you trying though? Because I've read books where I'm not, like, where the ethnicity is outside mine all the time, because I've read books by white authors, and you get used to it, but they can't read books by authors of color, or they just can't do that. Why can't they do it? I don't know. I don't really buy it, I guess, from my perspective.
Yeah, I believe this is like an American phenomenon too. Like, I don't even think it's a European phenomenon. Like, they'd be like, oh, this is interesting, I have to understand more, right? They're like, but in America, there is a significant culture of how dare this non-American appeal. Like it's toxic to them. They can't even even begin to consume it. That goes with anything that isn't white, straight up. It's just, there's a large percentage of people in the US that think that way, and it's ingrained in their culture. This is why a lot of businesses in the South don't ever like take off where they should, simply because a lot of the segment of the people in the South simply said, that's not a business that I should go into, because it's not for my people, whatever that means, right? And it's something like, even outside of books, right? If you look at like restaurants and stuff like that, those are fine because it's a service. You're serving them, so they have no problem being a patron in your business. But if it's a clothing store, or if it's some kind of design service or whatever, then all of a sudden it's not for me, whatever that means, right? So that's 100% based off of like the biases that's been in there for since Jim Crow, right? The idea of collectively, we don't participate in your economics, right? Unless you're serving us. And that goes with books as well.
I think, I do think it's hard for readers. I think that it's, I think it's a new concept for readers. And, the idea that there could be representation of people that aren't heterosexual, white, Christian, able-bodied, cisgender people in literature at all is still pretty new, and marginalized writers are still really fighting to get their stories told at all. But the conversation around representation in literature has been, I think, very limited to that conversation, the conversation about representation, the conversation around, we're an underrepresented or marginalized group. I want a character who is like me to show up in this book. And I think that's super, super important, right? Like, I'm not at all diminishing the importance of having a character who does represent all different kinds of people's experiences, all different kinds of identities in all different kinds of books. But I think pushing further than that and saying the book itself is anti-colonial, the world building is anti-colonial, is a new idea for a lot of people. And I think it's challenging for a lot of readers. I'm thinking about this based on an early review that I got for my forthcoming novel. I think part of the reason this is hard for people is that publishers don't really know how to talk about anti-colonial world building. They don't know how to market it. So my publisher had been pitching my book as having representation for a couple of different marginalized groups. And one of those groups is Jewish people. And I got a review from someone who felt like that wasn't true. And they were kind of upset that there were no Jewish characters in the novel. Well, it's a second world fantasy in which, you know, our religions and ethnicities that we have in this world don't exist. The world building of the novel is very much based on my experience as a Jewish person in a predominantly Christian culture. It relies on, you know, traditional elements of Jewish mythology. The fantasy language is based on Hebrew. A lot of the values and ideas come from Jewish tradition and history. But that's all world building stuff. Because there's no one in the novel who represents, you know, the experience of being a Jewish person. There was no own voices Jewish character in the novel. That reader didn't really know how to interface with this as a novel that was about, that could speak to their lived experience. And I don't, I hope that whoever wrote that review doesn't like see this panel and feel called out, because it's not at all what I mean to do. I like feel terrible if that were the case. I think it's just a matter of like, readers are perhaps not used to reading novels that deal with issues of identity on a world building level. As the furthest that we've gotten in the publishing conversation about representation and equity and diversity is like, oh, take some people from some minority communities and put them in your book, and then you will have good representation and you will have written a politically good book. And anti-colonialism really questions the structures of power in our whole society at the level of how the world is constructed. And that requires the reader to be prepared to go so much deeper into questioning things and interacting with that than books have traditionally asked of readers. And I think readers are maybe unprepared to do this. And I especially think publishers are not prepared to prepare readers to do it well. And so, you know, I went back and forth with my publisher, and we really struggled to find the right language to talk about the way that Jewish culture shows up in this world building that could accurately describe what I'm trying to do with it, not erase that part of it, but not give anyone, you know, expectations for a kind of representation they weren't going to find. So I think it's a difficult thing that writers of anti-colonial fiction are asking readers to do, because it's extraordinarily difficult to be anti-colonial, living in a colonized world, and a world that's been colonized for millennia, and where the history of colonization runs so painfully and so deep and affects every single part of our lives. Like I am, you know, sitting on colonized, stolen indigenous land right now as I speak to you, and I can't undo or erase that in this moment in time. And it would be more comfortable to not think about that for me and for everybody. And I think that we're asking a lot of readers when we ask them to question the assumptions that allow them to comfortably live in our world with its very uncomfortable history.
Just to add to what Anya says about representation, I feel like sometimes publishers also kind of pigeonhole the writers into writing specifically from one narrative, as a way to celebrate like a different character that you're writing about, or a different setting that you're writing about, and they are more interested about just the trauma. And so it's just the same thing being churned out, whilst you were trying to dismantle this power dynamics in your stories. You were kind of also sidelined into writing a very specific narrative about this anti-colonial world building concept that you're trying to write from as well. Thank you.
I think too, it depends on who you're writing for. So like Mina said, she was writing stories because she didn't see Asian American protagonists while growing up. So that's a very clear-cut reason why she's writing her stories. And if if she's writing for that target audience, it's going to be very different from someone who's writing for a target audience with the intention of, I'm going to sell the story to a big 5 publisher, or I want a normative audience to read it. I want to educate the people who need to be educated, or who I want to educate. So I think your end goal is going to dictate how you approach your anti-colonial world building. So for example, if I were like Nina to target an Asian American audience, I might not necessarily explain what's going on because I know my audience is going to get it. Whereas if I know my audience is primarily going to be the mainstream cishet white audience, then yeah, I'm going to have to explain what some of these inside jokes are and what I'm talking about, when I'm talking about blending in and not speaking up and having a protagonist who's not proactive, because that's what we're taught. That's how we're taught to be good people, is to not put ourselves out there. So yeah, I think it definitely depends on who you're targeting with your readership when it comes to your world building.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that, the ideas that you both brought up super quickly, because I think that speaks to something so important about like going beyond representation. I feel like publishing has gotten to a point where they're sort of comfortable with some marginalized characters showing up and being written by marginalized authors, but has not gotten as far as actually being comfortable with those characters existing in their full humanity and dictating the terms of how the story is going to go based on different cultural modes of storytelling. Or like there's been a great conversation going on Twitter in recent weeks about neuroatypical writers, and that agents and publishers may say, we're looking for diversity, we'd love to have more disabled writers. But then if you have a scene where characters are a character is perhaps expressing themselves in a typically neuroatypical way, the author gets told that's not relatable to readers. And I think that is a real struggle with where we're at, is that I think a lot of particularly like mainstream publishers kind of want to pay lip service to the existence of diversity without diving any deeper. And that's where I think anti-colonial world building is really important, because that bakes those big questions in at the level of the world so that they can't be escaped in the story.
I just want to make a note that also, while we're on the topic of publishing, that I don't know if we're also still on quotas for marginalized authors. Like I've heard some fellow marginalized authors mention that in the past they've been told, oh, well, we already have we're already publishing a book by an author from your ethnicity, marginalized group, whatever. And it really just seems to ignore the fact that, for example, if you write a book that is Asian fantasy, that doesn't mean that the other Asian fantasy is going to be the exact same. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we're just I don't know if publishing is ready to have that conversation yet. At least that's the idea I'm getting after hearing the rest of you talk, is that we're just not there yet at this point, which I kind of find a little disheartening, but that's just me.
Yeah, one thing I will say is this though. I'm independent, so I'm independent. I have a really big company, and one thing is you don't really need publishers or the industry at all. Third-party distribution is perfectly fine for a big independent publisher. A good example would be like I have a 1% audience. Like I don't care about 99% of the U.S. population. I only have like 1% that I'm really trying to sell to, right? And with that, I've sold 100,000 copies of my books, right? And now I have a third party distributor who's selling to Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Target, all those people. That's what they do, right? That's their job. They have to go and, play the politics of the publishing world, right? But, it doesn't change our dynamic. We're still selling to 1%, and we focus entirely on that. So, I don't see anything wrong with if the publishing industry wants to go and play gatekeeper, right? Just build another path. You say you don't need them, right? And you definitely don't need to negotiate with them, right? Because at the end of the day, almost all of the senior editors at these companies are white people, period, right? And they make the decisions, and there's no point trying to convince somebody who has a quota in their head or a certain slate that they feel is acceptable. They want to tell you how what's appropriate for readers of your ethnicity. So just go around them.
That was what I was going to say is certainly when it comes to traditional publishing, they might not have the ability to be as nimble as independent publishers or self-publishers do, or even a small press, right? A small but reputable press, let's put it that way. And so there are a ton of really successful indie publishers out there right now. I mean, I think the publishing industry has grown tremendously in even just the last few years, much less the last 10 years. So there's lots of different options to get your story out there. And you'll find that you're not competing with the one other Asian author in the stable or the one other Black author in the stable. There's room for everyone at the table. And that's what I love about the industry right now, is that it has evolved so fast and become so much more inclusive in just the last couple of years that I think it's an exciting time to be writing and telling your own stories.
So I have this great list of world building questions, but when you guys are speaking, I'm also writing other questions because I feel like it all relates and it's so interesting. Something that Mina was talking about, or that everyone kind of touched upon that I think is interesting, is this idea of I can't relate. And I feel like I've been hearing that a lot from publishers and from on Twitter a lot. So I was curious, in terms of anti-colonial world building, what is the author's responsibility to the reader? Like, do you feel like there is any responsibility to the reader, or is this idea of like, I can't relate something that you factor in when you're writing, or is it just, you're going to write pure and just see where it goes?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a little bit of both. So I've had beta readers who are Asian. I've had beta readers who are not Asian. And sometimes if the not Asian one doesn't get a thing, I'll try to hash it out with them and see how they respond. And then I'll make a decision about whether or not to explain the concept going from there. But otherwise, but usually when I'm trying to think, because it depends really on the situation too. Like if I'm gonna be writing like something like a food, like a food item, like for example, egg pancakes, which are damping in Mandarin. So for one, in the story I was writing, I just wrote it out as damping, and I figured if the editor didn't really had a problem with it, they could just say, well, we need you to explain this. But otherwise, I was just thinking, well, that's how I think of it. I don't think of it as actual egg pancakes when I'm making them or if I'm getting them from a stand. I mean, that's just really one small example. It is something I think about every now and then, about whether or not some concepts have to be explained. But I've also seen discussions on Twitter about non-Western storytelling and how often that's gotten panned by editors in Western, just Western locations. And I've actually felt some frustration about that too, because some of my storytelling tends to go in that direction or has been influenced by Asian works. And and sometimes being told to put in more action or put in more drama just makes me go, okay, but that's not where I'm trying to go with this.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like there's this pressure to hold the reader's hand so much from the beginning right to the end that by the time you finish the story, it's almost, you've really stripped away the magic of the world that you've just built or the setting that you've created. You've stripped the character down, simplified it, and it really just doesn't resonate with you as the writer, or it doesn't resonate with who your target audience is for. So I totally agree with what Mina said.
I mean, I think that writers have a really limited responsibility to their readers. I think that readers have a ton of control over their reading experience. And being in the stage I'm in right now, where I'm just kind of putting my first novel out into the world, advanced reader copies are out there, and I'm starting to get my first reviews, I have to tell myself several times every day, like, all I can do is write the best story I can and put it out there, and people will get it or they will not get it based on a wide variety of factors that are completely outside of my control. And trying to preemptively make every part of the story accessible and comprehensible to every reader, I don't think that's going to work. And in fact, the more you do that, the more you recreate the sense that readers from marginalized communities have of always being on the outside, always being different. If you over-explain the things that come from that world to try to appeal to a more like mainstream audience, then you're just kind of recreating an assumption that whoever's reading this book has a set of, cultural touch points that not every reader is going to share. So like we see this, one big place I see this as a conversation in publishing is should words that are from or derived from foreign languages be italicized in text? And until very recently, that was the standard, right? Is that anytime you used a word taken from any foreign language, except in academia, I remember when I was writing my thesis, you don't have to italicize. It's like French, Italian, Spanish, and Greek and Latin, because you can quote unquote assume everyone knows those. So like, I don't think it could be any clearer that what they're saying is like, if it's a white language, it doesn't need to be exoticized by going in italics. If it's not, you'd better point out that these are different words. They're different than the other words by literally like changing the way they look on the page. And that's something I struggled with. I actually, when I was writing Queen of All, I kept catching myself with my, made up fantasy terms that were derived from Middle Eastern languages. I kept catching myself italicizing the words as I was writing, because that was how I was so used to seeing it written. I, colonized myself as I was going, and I kept having to go back and unitalicize them. And I guess I felt like that was my trade-off in the end, was that I asked my editor to print a glossary so that readers could go look up the terms if they wanted to. But in the text, it would just flow naturally. That's one solution. But I don't think there was an obligation to include that if I had chosen not to. I think that it's up to a reader whether or not they want to put in the work to engage with this kind of writing.
Yeah, I want to say Anya makes a really good point about exactly how much to explain terms from your own culture. So my story in Alphabet of Embers actually includes Hanzi, or just written traditional Chinese. And at some point I did have to actually go and explain a little, because some of the portions were a bit long and otherwise readers wouldn't get it. I didn't really mind doing that, but I can see how that might be explained, just because I guess the languages just appear so different. Because I know I had a hard time learning it growing up. And then when I started learning Spanish, it was actually easier because the language was actually in a Roman alphabet. I was like, oh, I can get this. Whereas, yeah, so I can see that. And I would be interested to see how readers who couldn't read Chinese, how they managed with stories like John Chu's. He wrote this great story called The Water That Falls on You from Nowhere. And there are portions of it that had Hanzi, and that was actually what inspired me to write Dreaming Keys in the Alphabet of Embers anthology the way I did. Because before it was just so new to me. I didn't think that people could do that. I didn't think people could just write that out in a story that was mainly for English readers and have people get it. I thought if I had to do that, I would have to do the thing where I'd have to italicize, or I'd have to explain it, or I'd have to Romanize it. And the Romanization of Chinese or of Mandarin in my head is like a mishmash of pinging and what I had in my head before pinging happened, unfortunately. So that would have been a mess. But yeah, it's just, some things that I don't know how much I ought to explain, because I'm working on a fantasy novel that is also a love letter of sorts to, wuxia, Chinese kung fu martial arts dramas that I've seen as a kid and growing up. And I'm not exactly sure how much to explain necessarily when it comes to certain behaviors, certain customs, certain foods even, because right now I'm like, there's a scene in the first chapter where the main character is eating what we have as birthday noodles for their birthday, and they're longevity noodles. And I don't know how to go, like, should I go and explain why they're so hair thin and what you do? And should I use the term like longevity noodles, or should I use the term that is in Taiwanese? So there's a lot that you need to figure out and see how much you need to just kind of explain, or see if maybe the editors will help you fix it.
Hey, I think the number one responsibility for somebody who's an independent publisher is to understand how to convey their messages to their customers. You should know who your customer is, right? If you don't know who your customer is, you probably should hold off on writing your book until you figure out who the heck you're selling to, right? But once you figure that out, then you know what they understand, what they don't understand in the world, and you can start strategizing ways to make it relatable, right? Use common vernacular if the cultures is just way too confusing. All right, and then when you can use the original stuff, right? Strategically. For example, I write about ancient Egyptian mythology, right? I use Kemet because anybody who sees an Egyptian will say, hey, that's an Egyptian, right? So they automatically can get it. They don't need me to go and say Egypt. I just say Kemet, which is the original one. But let's say Pharaoh. What if I use the original name of a Pharaoh in the main language? People might not understand that. So I use Pharaoh instead because everybody knows Pharaoh, right? And they're like, oh, but that's the Greek word. It's like, whatever, right? I use the original names of the characters. I use original language whenever it's similar to the Greek version, right? So instead of avaris, avar, right? Instead of, things like this make huge differences in how the content is consumed, but doesn't alienate the original audience, right? And says, okay, this is like a Greek version of an Egyptian tale. And I also understand that I'm talking to kids most of the time. So I have to make sure that my language is a certain way, and I have to explain why something might be politically inaccurate, right? So this is a thing that I see done very well in Chinese ancient, stories. So we're talking about like, Three Kingdoms and stuff like that. They'll explain why you just insulted him. They're not gonna say, you insulted me, how dare you? They're gonna be like, do you understand why you have basically crossed, like they have characters they bring into the story specifically to explain the cultural significance. And that might be the only role of that person. That person might get his head chopped off the very next second. But the whole idea is somebody's going to explain it in a way that doesn't sound like it's a footnote in the story. It's actually a part of the story in some kind of way. So I just think that's something you need to be aware of when we're doing it, right? Because we do have a responsibility to explain it to our core audience, not anybody else. Who cares about everybody else? But the core audience needs to at least be able to understand what you're writing about. So that's what's up.
One of my many careers was as a marketer. So what Manuel's saying about your core audience totally resonates with me, because the key to good marketing is coming up with the right content, the right message for the right person at the right time. I mean, that's all it is. And everything else is just tactics. And so that's why I mentioned earlier, you do need to know who you're writing for, because that's going to inform every other decision you make as a writer. I think the responsibility that you take on as an author of how much do you handhold and how much do you don't is something that is going to be, it's going to be a personal answer for everyone. And everyone's going to have a different comfort level in terms of how much they feel like they can take on that emotional burden. Some of us are really tired from the last few years, and we don't have a lot of emotional energy right now. And if you can't deal, that's okay. Just, write what you can bear right now. And so it's going to resonate with someone. That story is going to affect someone. And when you do have the emotional energy to take on more responsibility later, then great, go ahead and do that. One of the things that, one of the conversations that I followed recently that I thought it just encapsulated so much of how I was feeling as an immigrant that I didn't know how to put in words before. And that's that we often feel like we have a dual responsibility to not only be experts in the world that we were raised in, but also experts in the world that our parents came from, that our ancestry comes from. And it's doing twice the work that everyone else is doing. And I think that's really tough, when you're afraid to put your story out there because you feel like the purists are going to come and attack you for, oh, well, that's not accurate, or that's not right, or that's not how it was done back then. And versus, your experience as an immigrant where you're part of melded cultures, and this may be the way that the story has evolved since it's been told to you, since it's been passed down to you. So I think, reclaiming that or taking ownership of the fact that, your story that you're going to tell has evolved from the origin stories that your ancestors came from, and that's okay. That's just a natural part of how stories evolve, and you have the right to tell that story the way you want to. I think that lifts some of the burden of, oh, I need to be an expert in Chinese mythology and Western mythology. And that sort of fear of responsibility can paralyze some writers.
It definitely paralyzed me. Like, I've had that story idea for probably more than a decade, and it's only been now that I've finally gotten brave enough to go, well, people are going to get it or they're not going to get it. You might as well just write it out and just let others help you fix it. But yeah, having to research, worrying about research, worrying about getting everything right, and then realizing that, for one, my language skills in Mandarin and traditional Chinese just really aren't up to snuff enough to be able to become that far out. I just had to go, all right, well, this story will be whatever this story will be, and others can deal.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in the same spot. For the longest time, I was really afraid to write stories that had an Asian influence because I didn't feel Asian enough to write them, which is completely sad because when I think about, my viewpoints and my opinions and how I approach the world, it is definitely Asian influence. I have a very strong mother who's a big presence in my life, and she's totally influenced the way I look at the world. And I just don't think of it that way. I think of, well, it's something I need to fight because I want to integrate with American society. Now that I'm older, I'm no actual numbers, but I'm over 40. I look back and I think, wow, I wasted so much time fighting my identity when I could have spent that time learning how to better integrate the two of them together, and all the different influences and all my different loves. And I could have been writing a lot, I could have been writing seriously a lot earlier. But yeah, that fear definitely holds a lot of us back.
I just wanted to quickly just follow up on Cindy. I'm 20% Andes Indian, right, from a father's side, and I wrote an Incan comic book series, right, because I'm like, hey, I checked that marker on the list. I'm blood related, so get at me, right? and so long as you got some blood relation, man, go ahead and do whatever the hell you want to do with your culture, because can't nobody gatekeep you and say you're not good enough and everything else. You just freaking, write your stories, and there really ain't nothing they could do, man. You say, so I don't look Asian enough to you. You can actually gain a following from fighting the people who are gatekeeping you online. They'll be like, man, you can't tell her what to do, and you'll literally blow up overnight. You might get a Yahoo article or something. So fight the good fight, tell your stories, and it can only benefit you so long as you're built like Teflon. Don't let them hurt your feelings. All right, and it'll only benefit you.
I mean, this is definitely, you know, a big fear of mine, going to, you know, in the YA space, which can be so contentious online, famous for Twitter drama, I think, at this point. I worry about people saying that I've gotten things wrong, especially because, you know, within my own communities, there is a lot of gatekeeping. You know, is somebody going to tell me that I can't say that I'm writing an own voices lesbian novel when in high school I dated a boy? Is somebody going to, am I going to get something wrong about Judaism from someone else's perspective, that they're going to come back and try to invalidate my identity from within my own community or from their own bad understanding of what that community is from the outside? And I think some of those things are inevitable. I am not built like Teflon. I am built like a squishy marshmallow of sensitiveness and lots of big feelings. And so, you know, I try to practice good self-care and be aware that it's coming and all of those things. If I had better advice for how to deal with it, I'd share it. I don't. Been crying a lot lately. But I think that there's a bigger political thing at play here, which is that, yes, if you are writing, trying to write from the perspective of a colonized people, and you are yourself a colonized person, you are going to make mistakes in how you depict that culture, because one of the key ways that colonization works is by taking parts of your culture away from you. And nobody who lives under colonization has full and complete access to a perfect version of a pre-colonial culture, because like we've lost access to our traditional languages and foods and songs and dances and clothing and stories. And the way that those things have been received by every individual person living in a colonial world is going to be different because it's been fractured by colonialism. And so I think reminding myself of that, I think has been really important, to see if I get something wrong, it's not because I failed somehow or I didn't do enough research or I'm not good enough at being a member of my own culture that I've been part of since I was born. It's because that is how colonialism operates. It operates by taking the, you know, integrity and completeness of the culture away from the people that it should belong to. And I think it's really important to honor that as part of the experience. And even if I'm trying in my fiction to imagine through that kind of world building, a world where that isn't true, a world where the culture has not kind of been through this trauma of colonialism, it's important, I think, to recognize that in the real world that I'm operating and writing in, and that readers are reading in, that did happen. And that is the reality. And that isn't going to be undone by me personally as I sit down to write my YA fantasy novel. So I think recognizing that, and also I feel really, really strongly that it's important for marginalized writers to take the burden of perfect representation off of ourselves as individuals, because no one has ever read a novel by a straight cis white man and been like, oh, this must be what straight white cis men think about everything. Right? That only happens to marginalized writers. And it's because of this really limiting mindset that there's a quota, or there can only be so many stories coming from a certain culture, or there can only be a certain number of authors of a certain type. No one reads stories in the majority onto every single member of that majority. But for anyone who's been in a minority, I mean, we probably all know the experience of feeling like, you know, someone in my group did something bad publicly. Am I going to be blamed for that? Is that going to be read onto us as people? And I think that absolutely extends to writing. And in some ways, you know, that added burden is there. I'm not going to be able to stop feeling like I have an added responsibility to do a good job writing, you know, a Jewish lesbian fantasy novel, because I can literally I can only think of 2 other fantasy authors that incorporate Jewish culture into their world building. I do feel that added weight, but I think it's important to recognize that it's not fair that that's there, and you don't have to like accept that burden into your heart. You know, you can look at it and you can say like, yeah, I'm doing an imperfect job. I'm doing an imperfect job because the ability to be fully immersed in my own community's culture was taken away from me. And now I'm doing the best that I can, and I'm trying to do a lot more than writers who are from a majority culture have to do, because they don't have to represent their whole people in their one work. They can just let their work speak for itself. So I think that's the framing that helps me be a little kinder to myself with all of this.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Anya, because colonial stories are often, you know, they're still comprised of racial beliefs and cultural conceptions that feed into the colonial empire's superiority, or like this extremely dominant and prevalent narrative that colonial societies brought into a lot of our own civilizations, or a lot of our societies. And so these anti-colonial stories that we write, or this anti-colonial world building that we create, it's exhausting because we're also like critically challenging and dismantling these normalized narratives in like previously, we could even say, uncontested spaces. So like Cindy had said, you know, it's navigating your individual, you know, identity as a writer between the traditional spaces that your family or your identity and heritage is from, and the westernized space that you're writing in for these, so your stories can get published. And it is a burden that the writers who are not part of the marginalized communities, they can use it as examples, but they would never be able to really understand what the lived experience is for us as marginalized writers. Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and let Mina finish up with this question, and then we'll move on.
No, I just wanted to say that what Anya said, I just found really powerful, especially since I've always grown up in the mindset that I always have to try and hew close to my heritage. For example, trying to have like, you know, near perfect Mandarin, which is not going to ever be possible. Mine is at a 4th grade level. You're just going to have to deal with it. But you know, growing up, I kind of always just felt like lesser than for not being that close, for not knowing that language. And it was compounded by the fact that I had a speech delay. I didn't talk until I was 2.5. And of course, if you want to see more colonialist, colonialist ideas, the doctor told my parents, yeah, your kid is getting confused by hearing Mandarin and English all the time. You better start speaking English. So I didn't start speaking Mandarin or learning Mandarin until I was 4. So that put me behind everybody else. And I got a lot of, wow, your classmates have so much better Mandarin than you. And I gotta say, if you're learning a language and you're a child, that is one of the worst ways to teach your kid to do anything, or to just motivate them to learn anything. So yeah, I managed to get a passable grip on it, but it's important to remember that, of course, at the time, especially up here in Michigan, resources were extremely limited, especially in the late 1980s to 1990s. And especially for a child who was probably the only Chinese kid in her 1st grade class. And it was just going to be an uphill battle all the time. So yeah, I really need to do what Anya said, just start cutting myself some slack and realize that, like, yeah, you're operating with limited resources. You know, do what you have to do. But I'm just really grateful that she said that.
Thank you so much for sharing. This has all been so inspiring, and hopefully it'll inspire writers. And for those who it does inspire, What are some things that they can keep in mind when they start trying out anti-colonial world building, or like when utilizing it? How do they start?
So I write epic fantasy, which means that world building is a really big chunk of the job description. Um, if you also write in this genre, if you're also writing second world fantasy, a lot of times you'll find online all of these kind of checklists that have all the questions you need to ask yourself as you build your world. How does the currency work? What do people wear? What kind of jobs do people have? All of these things. What I try to do is think about what are the political ramifications of each of those questions and what do they mean about the colonial politics of the world. um and I think that's a really important way to start, is like incorporating it, making it central into your world building, and really working on that from the ground up. And then to return, I think I alluded to this earlier, um being clear just within yourself about what kind of message you want to send about colonialism as a to your readers, which doesn't mean that every reader is going to get it, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be communicated perfectly. But in terms of like, if you want to have a world where the central obstacle is colonialism and characters fight together and overcome it, if you want to have a world where you're going to show the negative effects of colonialism more clearly because you're constructing it in a secondary world and it's easier to see that, if you want to have a world that is utopian in which colonialism never happened, or where it happened really differently than it did in our world in history. So think about where you sort of like the anti-colonial politics of your world building to end up, and ask yourself those questions early on as you're developing the story, because for it to be really part of the world building, it does kind of need to be baked in from the beginning like that.
Yeah, just to add on to what Anya said, I think we also have to keep in mind that as we're building these communities, we're not fetishizing the communities that we're drawing inspiration from. Although the work is fictional and it's something that we have created, we must also remember that we're writing from a place we know, and that we're not co-opting the existing realities that these these places, these people, these communities that we are drawing inspiration from, and minimizing them and their existence in the worlds that we create. Thank you.
I think that's a great word that Isabella brought up, fetishizing. Definitely with current events going on right now, that's a topic that's relevant and probably not one that's going to go away anytime soon. One of the examples of colonial world building that made me very uncomfortable when I first saw it was the movie Avatar, and seeing, gosh, I don't even remember the name of the alien race, the Na'vi, I think they were called. And the way they were depicted, like, I'm not Native American in any way, shape, or form, but I saw that alien race and I thought, oh my gosh, that's basically a ripoff of Native American cultures and customs and looks, and I was just, I felt very uncomfortable by that movie. And so yeah, when you're building your world, be careful of the tropes and the stereotypes you're bringing in, because sometimes they may be masking a bias that you don't even know about that you had. Like Mina said early in this panel, I had a critique partner who created this race of characters where I was like, yeah, you might want to look into the history of how we've treated our Native American folks on this soil, because you pretty much just recreated the March of Tears or the Trail of Tears. And he had no idea. He had no idea he'd gone there. And so, yeah, I would say know your history, or at least be aware of it, and be mindful of the stereotypes and tropes that you're bringing in, and make sure that you're not resonating with a harmful portrayal of someone else.
Yeah, I just want to build off of what Cindy was saying. look at, descriptions of characters. Are you using, for example, the word exotic? Are you using it unironically? If you're using, if you're using the word exotic and not really looking into why that's being used, or why that's not really a good way to describe someone that's not really from outside your just outside where you've been, out, who has a different way of life, you really need to think about how othering that is, and how that may make other readers who may be from the culture that they're that might be based off from. And also it goes to other things, not like, for example, you need to know your history, especially I've been thinking, for example, about East Asia and how the country and the history that those countries have. And it's a very contentious one. I don't know if a lot of people know that necessarily, because I have seen books, for example, where there's a Japanese ruler in China in the future. And I'm just thinking, did you really think about this? Because it doesn't look like you have. And it would be different if, someone else had written it, if it'd been written to point out, yeah, this isn't great because yada, 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 because of the culture, or if they'd just really thought about that. So even if you're writing something that's involving fantasy versions of these countries, you really need to keep that in mind. But also it goes to smaller things like food, because I just remember there was an article I read about Korean food, and I guess it comes to things about how and I realize they're probably not experienced with things like, for example, like gochujang or stuff that's fermented, but when they use the word funk, because, in Chinese, Taiwanese cultures, we have like, soybean paste and soy sauce, and that's fermented. And I'm just thinking, I grew up with these foods, and you think they smell? And I guess that's something I should be used to, because of course that was, the lunchbox taunts and everything. I didn't get the lunchbox taunts, but I've heard of them. But you have to also really think about how you want to describe those foods, and you don't necessarily have to describe them as like the most delicious thing you have, especially if your character has like doesn't like things like maybe overly sweet or overly strong flavored. But you don't have to go into like don't describe the foods as gross just because they're outside your culture. Just don't. Like, if it's one thing if the character doesn't like them because maybe they're too spicy, or maybe the flavor is too strong, or it's just unfamiliar to them, or the texture is just not what they're used to. But going straight to, wow, this is disgusting, is, you really want to rethink that.
Yeah, I'm a pretty masculine guy, so I tend to do everything in war, right? There's somebody getting killed in almost every single stories that I write. It's just the way it is, right? I write stories about, ancient wars, cultures fighting each other, empires forming and falling, right? And one thing I love doing, which even Europeans do themselves, they have a lot of anti-colonial stories that they do, especially in places like Germany and stuff like that. They'll be quick to show you some ancient German folks beating the Romans up, right? They're gonna show you in a heartbeat that their ancestral culture is not something that should be scorned and uncivilized, right? It was their culture. And that's something that we focus on heavily. We like telling the story about the little guy going against the big empire, right? And killing them, right? Defeating them, dying a glorious death because they won't accept the rule of the superior culture, right? And showing how horribly not one-sided it was, because a lot of things we hear about Native Americans, 500 people came on a boat and conquered the Incan Empire. What? That's not what really happened, but they say that, right? Because they're trying to basically downplay the original culture and make it seem like this was just superior. We just had superior tactics and superior weapons, and these people had nothing but bows and arrows, and he said the Inca had hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the field. They had a civil war, which the Spanish said, okay, let's go and ally some of these enemies of the Inca, and let's have 60,000 of their troops aid our 500 people and still struggle for like 25 years to freaking beat them, right? And it's like this story is a very different story from the 500 guys on a boat, you know, totally annihilated an empire the size of half of America. You know, that kind of stuff you need to be able to bring to light to show the fragility of what has been created, right? When you keep letting these myths go around of the 500 people who defeated an empire and once they had guns they totally conquered Africa. He said they didn't really conquer Africa until like the 1800s. Before then, they were very strategic about going into Africa. They were like, all right, we got guns and all, but we'll still get hemmed up by Nigerians. So let's just wait for a second until we get better guns and a lot more money, and then we can come back and actually conquer Africa. They didn't do that stuff earlier, and we have to be able to see that and recognize it. And once we recognize that, we find chips in the armor, right? It's just it's the colonial period right now that we're in, but empires come and go, you know, eras end. It's just the way it is. And somebody else's era is going to begin as well. Who knows? Maybe we're going to be in the era of China one day, soon, right? Where China takes over half the world. I don't know. They have good momentum, right? They might be able to pull it off, but somebody's going to be the big fish, right? And the more you take away the myth that it's always going to be Europe, right? The better off you'll be, because they only had it for a very small period of history. They had a very tiny sliver, right? The Mongolian Empire lasted longer. So let's talk about it.
Do you have any research tips that writers should be aware of when they're trying to do this kind of world building?
That's a hard one. I have to be honest with you, because it's all personal takes on whatever you research. You know, like I research a lot of things that I'd be like, oh, that's not really flattering. I'll cut it, right? And there's certain things that are like great, but also make no sense for, you know, from a storytelling perspective, right? That I feel could be cut in order to tell a better story. So, you know, at the end of the day, the main thing you should be focusing on is who your customer is. Once you figure that out, you know, you can figure out which research is proper for your story and which stuff won't help at all, right? And you can go from there, you know?
This is where the strength of Googling and Wikipedia really comes in, is you can get a lot of just surface skimming on a topic or an era or culture just by Googling and reading Wikipedia articles and etc. And then once you've decided, okay, this is where I'm going to focus, then you can narrow your search and your articles and your resources down to a much more narrow and defined source, like an academic source or a research paper or historical text, you know, things like that. So when people say they want to write about a certain era or a certain culture, I say, great, well, you know, start with Wikipedia, start with Google, get a basic understanding of what you're dealing with, because you don't know what you don't know, right? That's what people always say. So for example, I'm currently writing a novel set it's a historical fantasy, so that makes it a little easier because I know exactly which era I'm going into. But it's set in 1950s McCarthy era America. Well, there's a crap ton of resources about this period of history, and I'm also spanning 2 different continents because part of it's set in China and part of it's set in America. And so, you know, I just started reading about the era in the Wikipedia articles and just going down rabbit holes and things like that. And then I finally, you know, figured out resources like, for example, I honestly did not know a whole lot about Mao Zedong. So I've got this really thick book that I found that basically goes over his entire life history, and that will sort of inform the setting and the culture and some of the drivers of the story. But I didn't get there right away. You know, I had to start with the surface level stuff, you know, and that, yeah, starts with stuff like Wikipedia.
If I could give writers some advice about this, my advice would just be to start sooner than I did, because the way that I did this was I pretty much already had the whole book pre-written in my head way before I got around to doing the research to go into my world building. And that means that there's so many like totally amazing, super, super cool things that I found while I was doing that research that I can't use in this book. Like, there's maybe an offhand reference to it in one line because, like, I don't know, one example of this is all the kind of world building stuff I did to fill in particular gaps in the book, right? So I needed a list of like mythical creatures that could exist in this world. And all the ones I found to populate this world with are so cool. And I really wish that I could put them in my book. And there's nowhere for them to go in the plot. They just like, I don't have a room for them. I don't have a spot for them to go in. I realized, you know, as I was listening, Cindy, to what you were saying, that it has a lot to do with the way that I read in preparation for writing this book. And I didn't really think of a lot of the reading that I did in preparation for this book as being in preparation for this book, because for those of you who don't know, I started writing this book when I was like 12. So it was all the books that I read as a kid. So I came into this book, right, the process of writing this book, extremely prepared for the YA fantasy genre because I had read every work in the genre that I could physically get my hands on, right? And without realizing it, that really made me an expert in the tropes of the genre and what things I wanted to undermine and what things I wanted to recreate, and sort of everything about fantasy world building and everything about how to build a magic system well, and court intrigue, and the big scene where everybody shows up at the ball and there's a lot of drama. Like, I was very prepared for all of those things from what I had read. I had not read widely and deeply in terms of the cultural elements that I might want to include in my world building. And I think that the world building would be a lot stronger and the book would be a lot better if I had done that. So I will give to you, the listeners, the advice that I did not get myself, which is to start that process of reading as widely as you can, hearing all kinds of different things, just to pick up little different interesting tidbits that you can use, right? I hope that, you know, when I start my next work, I'll be able to do that, and end up with a better result.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess it would be about bearing in mind you're reimagining the worlds that you are writing from. And if we are going to come from the anti-colonial world building perspective, how are we changing the normalized descriptors that we have come to accept when we read stories about ourselves? Like, for example, in the Indigenous perspective, there's so many Indigenous communities, and we have different ways of living, different ways of different foods, even, you know. Just because you've read about a specific Indigenous community doesn't mean that you apply it, like, you know, do like a generic kind of world building based on that one Indigenous community. So it's also about, if I'm going to draw from something that exists in today's reality, am I going to offer the same dignity that I would offer myself if I was being written about me? You know, I was writing about me in this story. So it's like, you know, like Cindy and Mina were saying, it's exhausting because you have this double burden as someone who comes from, you know, the communities that are not necessarily the white-centric or Eurocentric lenses that we are continuously bombarded with stories. So it's great that we are so hyper aware of how we are building this, you know, doing this anti-colonial world building. But we also have to remember, like, we're reimagining like futuristic worlds, so we're reimagining like historical eras and how we would like the story to be told, and not from the white lens that we've been reading all this time. Thanks.
Yeah, so there's already been a lot of great answers from the other panelists. So I also do wiki, and then sometimes I also branch out into other websites that may go more in depth for what they're for the subject matter that I'm looking for. Another thing that I have done, at least for my work, is watching Chinese historical dramas, or at least historical-ish dramas, because I don't think Nirvana and Fire is that historical, but it was one that my mom at least recommended to me in the terms of the research and culture, the cultural research that had gone into it, right from the costumes to how people were behaving, the way the palaces were built, so on and so forth. Because the era in China that I'm pulling mine from is not from that era necessarily. I think they're warring states, if I'm not mistaken. I could be, but mine is probably about maybe hundreds of years later, probably like the Song Dynasty or even the Ming Dynasty. But it's a good way to see how maybe things may have been built or how people behaved and so on and so forth. So that, of course, your mileage may vary because, of course, some Chinese historical dramas aren't as detailed and the costumes can be off. And I will know if my mom starts making remarks, because at one point I was trying to show her a drama I was watching and she said, "No one's hair is like that. No one has clothes like that. What is wrong with all of this?" And then later she watched it because it had the star of Nirvana and Fire in it, because she likes him now. I don't know. But if I'm not watching those, I'll also watch, she recommended some great documentaries that were filmed in China called A Bite of China. And a lot of it will just go around the country and showcase not just the foods and how they are made, but also the human stories behind them. The audience apparently did not like the human stories, and my mom did not like the human stories, but I actually found them really fascinating because I learned a lot, not because from stuff like, you see these really intricate dough sculptures. I guess you would call them that. Like, they're just really intricate and they're so detailed. And I thought, wow, you would have to be a professional baker and you'd have to have really special tools to make them. And they're just old women in a village and they're just using like really basic things you could probably find in your kitchen to go make them. And I'm just going like, oh, wow. Wow, I didn't know that could happen. I didn't know that was a thing. And my mom's like, yeah, you just have to be resourceful. You're too American. You just have to be resourceful. You just use whatever you need. Just use what you have. But that was a real big eye opener. And then sometimes when, for example, I think they were making something like tangmian, which is, or like little rice dumplings you eat in soup around the winter or at the end of the Chinese New Year. And my mom would point out, she'd see these people grinding this giant stone mill. She's like, yeah, we used to do that in Taiwan. I'm like, oh, wow, that is cool. Because now we buy the flour in bags in the Chinese grocery. But it's, I guess that is me rambling a bit. I'm sorry. But the point is that even documentaries like that from the cultures that you are researching can really give you a window of insight in how these things are treated and how they are seen. And it might, instead of like maybe from a Western culture that might have a different sort of eye and maybe go like, oh, this is just really interesting and perhaps whatever, it might have some unsavory colonial tones that they're not really catching. Whereas if you're at least from the culture it originated from, it's going to be a bit more, I don't know, authentic, different.
All right, we're at the final question. For those people who would like to research more about this or to get some more examples, do you have any examples of your own of any stories or TV shows or movies that they can watch or read to get some more examples of anti-colonial world building?
Well, they can definitely download my app because my app comes out April 5th. It's called BSP Comics. It has like 40 different titles on there from Black and Brown creators. And, most of the titles are historical in nature. So you're going to see a lot of anti-colonial stuff throughout the entire thing. You can consume it at your own pace. It's free, and, go from there. That's more of a visual medium, right? It's comics, right? So it's not like novels. But I guess it kind of sticks out more when you can actually see, anti-colonial elements, right? So
I've got a few. I saw Anya unmuted themselves and I was like, oh shoot, I better, because I've interrupted a few people already. So I think I think one of the reasons why Black Panther was so huge was because it presented a narrative about Black folks that was not about trauma, right? It was not about them being any more, not about them being subjugated to a different power. In fact, Wakanda, technologically speaking, was even more advanced than the rest of the world. Yes, they were coming out of an isolationist status, but they were technologically advanced. They were, it was just great characters, and they happened to be set in an African nation of Wakanda. So that was a great anti-colonial story, just because you got the diversity without the trauma of colonialism. Another one that was really great that I read was the Binti novella series by Nindi Okorafor, and it's she calls it African futurism, not Afrofuturism, because it specifically comes from a culture that is on the African continent and not just from the African diaspora. And it was just, I loved the protagonist because she brought her culture into the world building without it just being like in your face of here's my culture and you're gonna like it or what. It was just a natural part of the world. And in a way that incorporated that culture into the climax, the resolution, and who that character was. It was just beautifully done. And of course, I have to mention the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang, because she just did an amazing job of presenting these warring colonial powers, really is what they are, in an alternate history, China, and just it was just beautifully drawn out. Definitely much better than anything that I could write or research or anything like that. And I really appreciated seeing a different narrative when it comes to China and its many colonial stories. And then finally, one that I thought was really well done in science fiction, also Binti was science fiction, but was the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey. It's the James S.A. Corey is two people, it's two dudes. And one of them spent 10 years building this world. So there's a lot of thought that went into this world building, obviously, because this was his baby project, like he wanted to turn it into an RPG. So there was definitely very thoughtful world building when he came up with the three main factions, which are Earth, Mars, and the Belters. And I thought it was incredibly well done how he was very systematic and very methodical in coming up with, okay, Earth colonized essentially two different regions of space, Mars and the Belt. And those two cultures are very different because of how they approach colonization and the geographical and environmental factors that they had to deal with. Like terraforming Mars is very different from dealing with the limited resources and confined spaces and low gravity, zero gravity, really, almost, situation of being on a moon station or an asteroid station as part of the belt. And it was just, and as each book went on, all the factions evolved as well. And I just thought it was really incredible how he handled colonialism and the results and the after effects of that in a science fiction setting.
Well, I was going to say the Poppy War. You stole mine. I will strongly second that recommendation. It is a novel that is really all about colonialism and colonization, or a series, and it is wrenching and extremely good. I share the sense of sort of like just vague envy of looking at and being like, wow, I wish I could write like that. For folks that are interested in the YA space, Jordan Ifueko's Raybearer came out last year, and I think has been a little bit underappreciated. It is a wonderful fantasy novel set in an African-inspired world, not necessarily a non-colonialist one, but definitely one that thinks about the possibilities of world power centralizing in Africa rather than in what would be the equivalent of Europe. And I think it's a really, really interesting read. And then, I mean, I think everything that N.K. Jemisin writes deals with colonialism in a lot of ways, but particularly the 100,000 Kingdoms series, in which there are a titular 100,000 kingdoms, and the protagonist is someone from one of the colonized outer kingdoms who's called into a position of power in the center, and the kind of different conflicts that arise there, the cultural conflicts, the way gender is constructed by the colonial power as opposed to the colonized peoples is really fascinating. So those would be my recommendations. And I'm sure I'll think of more as soon as I stop talking.
I've just got two recommendations. One of them is by Daniel Heath Justice. He is an Indigenous writer from, I believe he's Canadian. He does speculative fiction, and he's also an Indigenous scholar. So he's one of his stories is called Tatabon, and he took the Wizard of Oz and he wrote a story from the perspective of the Scarecrow. But what he does is, he re-articulates the impacts of colonialism on Indigenous people, and it's a prequel to the Wizard of Oz story. And in the Wizard of Oz, the Scarecrow is like the bumbling fool, but in Daniel Heath Justice's story, he's the firekeeper of his people, and the one who carries the story of the Oz's colonization. I like the story because it's such a beautiful, beautifully written, heartbreaking account of love and betrayal, that occurs between, there's another character called Nick, who is meant to be the Tin Man and the Scarecrow. And so you don't realize what the genders are until right at the end. And I thought that was such a, it was his way of asserting that the gender normative narratives don't exist in the Indigenous storytelling, and it's something that, oh yeah, I'll mention it at the end, but it's not something that guides the story as he's telling the story. And I really like, because he, like I said, the reimagining of the worlds. He reimagines this iconic world and the colonial tropes that often frame popular fantasy or popular stories. And then he just, in the story itself, he illustrates the strength of the communities and the individuals who are written into the margins of what is considered popular fantasy for stories. The second one is not a story, it's more a poem. It's written by, his name is Aimé Césaire. He's French, but from Martinique. And he's the reason I chose this is because of the structure of the poem doesn't follow the rules of how a poem should be structured. So he's done away with the rules, and he's and bearing in mind this poem was written in 1930s. So he was already dismantling the way that the accepted poetry should be written. And it's structured like a lyric meditation, and then he goes into prose, and then he goes even into epic style of writing, where the narrator speaks as if he's an epic hero. And it's split into three parts. And the first part is about the poet's his questioning about his identity in his native country of Martinique. And the second part is about the history and who are the settlers or the visitors that have come and imposed their authority on the people of Martinique. And then the third is about him realizing the strength and the resilience of his people. And it comes out in a poem. And it's really beautiful because it asserts his heritage and his identity, and then he's he's coming from, because he went and he got an education in France. So this poem is written when he returns from France. So he's been removed from his native country, placed into a westernized society, and then he comes back and he realizes all these things have shifted for him. His perspectives have shifted. And I think it's a really great way of seeing how writers in the early 1900s were already dismantling these power dynamics that we are still trying to dismantle in 2021.
Right, so I'd like to second Black Panther. I thought that was just an amazing movie, and the world building, and I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. So I think that one ought to be like I guess a 21st century classic in a sense, just because of how really revolutionary it was, just from the storytelling, the world building, and how it just was not about really colonialism. And I also want to second Ifwego's Raybearer, which, despite the fact that it's not quite anti-colonial, it did reimagine what it would look like if African people were the centralized power. And I'm waiting for the second book. I think it's going to be amazing. I really loved it. I just loved every bit of it. Once I read it, I couldn't really put it down. Like it was just so great, like how everything was told and everything. And you had to kind of read it, and also just really, it was just really really easy to immerse yourself in. So 2 series I have not seen mentioned yet. Ken Liu's Dandelion Dynasty for fantasy was really, it's something that it is a series that is influenced very much by East Asia, but is not actually East Asian. You will see like some markers like food, how they eat, the clothing, the way the systems are set up, such as imperial examinations and so on and so forth. But the people in there, they'll have different hair and eye colors, but the world is very unquestionably very East Asian influenced. And it's really great to see a world like that, that is not where, it's not about, East Asian people in pain, East Asian people, having to suffer under, war or, well, no, there is actually a war. I think there is a war in the first book, if I remember correctly. It's been a while, but it's not from an outside colonial power imposing themselves onto it. It is an internal one. But it's one that, really kind of opened the door to me and trying to think about, how I would write and how you can build worlds. And the second one is Aliette de Bedard's, I think it's Suya universe. That's a sci-fi one. It's an amazing universe of, mind ships, and really having a world that is influenced by Vietnamese culture, and also like such as having things as, poems, and having the mind ships built to accommodate Vietnamese culture and so on and so forth. And it's not something that I would have also considered before when I started reading it in the early 2010s or so. I also want to quickly mention her novella Fireheart Tiger, which is which does have some, I don't want to say it has necessarily colonial tones in it, but it does have what I read as a European country, and what was basically Vietnam. And a lot of it was also it's a very short novel. It's a novelette. So it's a bit short of a story, but it did, however, kind of challenge biases that such as putting the country where they're, the non-Western country as barbarians, and challenging those biases, or challenging that the Western countries are always necessarily better.
All right, well, that was our last question. Thank you everyone so much for participating in this panel, and it was very inspiring, and I'm excited to hear what the viewers have to say. So thank you very much, and enjoy the Write Hive conference.